So I am here to say, where do we go from here? And I thought of a number of obvious possibilities, like around in circles, or up the wall, or nowhere fast. But of course, that's exactly where we're not going to go. Where we are going to go is forward. And before that, I wanted to share with you my little trip into the underworld, by the way. If you're wondering about this thing behind me, I sometimes think that folks like you who have real jobs might suspect that people like me become pundits because we have no useful skills of any sort. And that's why I wanted to show you what you see behind me. I missed part of yesterday afternoon because I was fixing that plumbing. And it's been in place for almost an hour now, and it hasn't disintegrated. Now that's its cue for the pipe to shoot off the tank and spray the power bar with water, which will either cause the screen to go blank or something even more exciting, and then you will know why I became a pundit. But in case that doesn't happen, so you think I may have some practical skills, I want to offer some practical thoughts on how we go forward. And as is perhaps typical of me, I have a view that's so simple it could be described as simple-minded. And it begins with what we need going forward is something, not nothing. And that may be obvious, but it's also important. And the next thing we need is progress on the most obvious points of contention here, starting with equalization. The first thing that needs to happen is that Alberta pays in a lot less money into that program. There are other things that could happen, but that's got to happen. And if Alberta pays in less, I assume other provinces will collect less unless BC and Ontario say, no problem, we'll make up for it. And I think that if other provinces get less, they will end up realizing it was a good thing for them. But whether they end up realizing that or not is secondary. The main thing that has to happen is equalization, as currently structured, is very near the top of the list of Albertans' frustrations about the Federation, and it's the easiest major thing to fix. So it gets fixed or else. You remember what Barry Cooper said, right? I'm not in favor of conflict, and I don't regard Canada as something that can be dismantled at no cost. Since you're probably tired of looking at my plumbing system, here you go, I'll show you something else. That's better, right? Now, that is, at the risk of rubbing some people the wrong way, that's a picture from Ontario. That's part of Canada. And if we could make Canada work, it would be better than not making Canada work. Partly because if humans can't make Canada work, I don't think they can make anything work. And secondly, because there'd be a lot of real practical costs to breaking up the Federation. But I am not in favor of unity at any price, because that makes you the sucker. If you start, as Barry Cooper warned about Peter Lougheed, if you walk in and say, whatever you do, we promise not to fight back effectively, then you can be very sure they're not going to do what you want. And so we must address equalization. If we can't even get that one fixed, if Canadian and Alberta political leaders are determined that nothing will be done about equalization, then we really will be going nowhere except up the wall or else out the door. So no more excuses on that one. It's got to happen, and it's got to happen promptly. And this underlines, of course, that part of when I say what happens going forward, part of it is what does the rest of Canada concede, which includes not just changes to equalization, but pipelines actually getting built. Okay? And building pipelines is not just symbolic. I mean, it is symbolic, but it's substantive, because it requires the federal government not only to do things that benefit the Alberta economy, which needs it and deserves it, but also to be very straightforward in theory and in practice that they are not attempting to destroy the Alberta energy economy. One gets the feeling that in Ottawa, the general idea was if we could put it out of its misery painlessly, that would be better. But in any case, it's going down. And it is important, to the point of being crucial, that the federal government concede that it is not going to destroy Alberta's economy. It is not going to destroy the engine of Alberta's economy, and its own, though it doesn't know it. It isn't going to do it by stealth, and it isn't going to do it directly. And again, I'm going to pass the hat here a little bit. Also, since maybe you don't like the Central Canadian images, I'll give you something else here. There, that's some tomatoes I'm growing. They may still be there when I get home, or the squirrels may have eaten them. So I am, among other things, executive director of something called the Climate Discussion Nexus, and I won't belabor the point about you needing to give us money other than to say, please give us money. But I will say that politicians need to find the courage to dispute the science and economics of climate change alarmism. Because if not, they rally us around the white flag. And I need to ask the Alberta government, do you share Justin Trudeau's view of climate change as an existential crisis requiring us to hit net zero? Because if you do, you should be out there pouring cement down the wells. But if you don't, you need to stand up to the cancel mob, who I suspect are somewhat brittle characters, and say, no, fossil fuels are not destroying the planet. And we need the federal government to concede that they are not going to destroy the Alberta energy industry on the theory that fossil fuels are destroying the planet. For that reason, I'd like to see the carbon tax repealed. It's far too small to achieve its intended goals or do a whole lot of practical harm. But I would like to see it repealed because it is a very important symbolic irritant. Another thing I'd like to see is the removal of interprovincial trade barriers. This bee travels between my brother's bonnet and mine very readily. And that's another thing that the federal government needs to do and can do and should do. And there's no real excuse for not doing it other than the usual timidity. But having said that, and having said that a lot of what's needed is federal, a lot of what is needed is for the Alberta government and political class to demand these things. Because as you may know in life and in politics, if you don't ask, the answer is always no. So one of the important things going forward is that we accept no excuses, not from Ottawa and not from Edmonton. No more, this is not the best time. No more, we mustn't ruffle feathers. Because it's very clear that there is no way we're going to fix the Federation if we don't ruffle feathers and if we don't do it now. And if Jason Kenney won't do it, find someone who will. Can I remind you about what Barry Cooper described, those negotiations between Peter Lougheed and Mark Lalonde, where Lougheed kicked off by surrendering, thinking it would increase his leverage, and it did the opposite. And here, just remember, there's this rule about poker. If you're a poker player and you've been sitting at the table for half an hour and you haven't identified the patsy, you're the patsy. And again, I know that a lot of people here have said they're just not interested in Canada. They've separated in their minds, and at some point you'll all realize we're right. And I hope that they're wrong, but not at the expense of being a patsy. And that's why a coherent separatist option, properly worked out, it's not just important as a negotiating tactic. It's important that it really be something you're prepared to do, that you know how to do, that you've thought about, and you're ready to do if you do not get sufficient concessions, that it ceases to be the most attractive option. And here I would like to warn you about one thing, is when one of the speakers said, you are living under a socialist government. But he didn't say whether he meant the one in Ottawa or the one in Edmonton. And it's important to understand that they're both, by any rational definition, socialist governments. The size of these governments, the intrusiveness of these governments, the casual disregard for your rights, the stuff that John Carpe talked about, the ambition to remake your life. And that means leaving Canada doesn't solve the big government problem. Maybe it brings it closer and puts it more within reach. But remember, no matter where you go, there you are. So it is not going to work to leave Canada if you don't also fix things in Alberta. And maybe if you fix things in Alberta, you won't need to leave Canada. Which brings me to the next thing that I think needs to be done. Not should be done, but needs to be done. Create an Alberta pension plan. Again, as you heard from my brother, this one is low-hanging fruit. This is eminently doable. It wouldn't just be an abstract assertion of provincial autonomy. It would save taxpayers and companies money at a time when they need to save money, when the Alberta economy is hurting. So I think it's fair to say if we can't do this one, we can't do anything. And that means it's also fair to say if they won't try, if the people in power, the politicians and the bureaucrats currently in power in Alberta will not try to do this, find someone who will. In addition to seceding from Canada, you could also secede from the establishment conservative parties. There are options. Now, speaking of APP, I think an Alberta provincial police force is also a good idea. And one reason why, as I talked about last year, a better deal for Alberta is also a better deal for Canada in all kinds of ways. There are many respects in which meeting Alberta's demands would feel like concessions from central Canada or from Ottawa, but would turn out to benefit everybody. And one of them here to me is that the RCMP is currently pulled in too many directions. It has too many responsibilities. It is failing to deal with things that a national police force needs to deal with, things like cybercrime and money laundering. And at the same time, it's doing a pretty indifferent job of policing rural Alberta. I think this is for me second tier. It's not, the last ditch, unlike equalization or the pension plan. But it's an example of the kind of things that need to happen, both for their own sake and because something needs to happen. What can't happen is nothing. And that means we're going to need courage. We're going to need it, and they're going to need it. They're going to need it in Edmonton, and they're going to need it in Ottawa. They're going to need it inside the big red machine, because it won't be easy for them to admit that Alberta needs to have its legitimate demands met, and they're going to need it in the sputtering blue machine federally. So again, and the things we do, here's something we don't do. Do not continue to support the federal Conservatives if they will not support you. The Alberta caucus needs to be very outspoken. They should push their Eastern colleagues to be outspoken on the need to meet Alberta's legitimate demands. And again, we don't need to be unpleasant, not in manner particularly, but we must be firm on substance. And it's possible to be both, because if we genuinely think decentralization is good, we think it's good for everyone. It's very possible to approach other provinces and their inhabitants, including Quebec, but not just Quebec, and say, you too should want what we want. I mean, when it comes to equalization, saying we want not to give you money and you should want it too, that's going to be a hard sell, though I think in the end they'd be glad. But on things like local policing, I mean, you don't have to convince the Quebecers, they've got their own police force. On things like more independence from suffocating Laurentian control, there's no reason you can't make this pitch to the Atlantic provinces. Certainly Saskatchewan on BC. Again, BC might not be raw, let's build pipelines, at least not coastal BC. The interior is a different story. But the overall pitch ought to be one that we can make without being snarly and belligerent. And here, let me unleash another of my bees, and that's healthcare. I think the Canada Health Act is unconstitutional. Health is a provincial responsibility, but it's certainly disastrous in terms of its effect on healthcare. And it is disastrous politically because it terrifies provincial governments into immobility. And for what? The Supreme Court ruled against the Quebec government's ban on private insurance in the Shaoli case. And that was partly because of Quebec's own Bill of Rights. But there are all kinds of things that provinces do, like banning dual practice by doctors, banning private insurance for medical services, that are not contrary to the Canada Health Act. There are all kinds of things a province can do to give patients more freedom. And boy, in an era when everybody's going around saying you own your own body, how is it possible that we say the government owns your body when you're sick? Talk about socialism. Alberta can really take steps to get rid of its waiting lists, not just promise to do it, but do it by taking independent steps in healthcare. The Fraser Institute actually did a paper last year on Albertan healthcare options. And one of the things it said is the use of private firms in the delivery of publicly funded healthcare services, so long as the firms are not charging additional fees and generally adhere to the principles of the Canada Health Act, is not, contrary to popular perception, prohibited by the Canada Health Act. And they go on to say that Bill 11 here did some things, but it's got a lot of flaws. Quote, specifically, the ban on the operation of private hospitals and the requirement that all major surgical services be delivered into public hospitals should be eliminated, end quote. And especially thinking in the time of COVID, the fact that people having routine operations who are not sick have to go in hospitals where they're treating COVID patients. This is a terrible idea. And they're canceling surgeries in hospitals to prepare for the COVID rush. If there were freestanding clinics to do a lot of things, like Brian Day's Canby Clinic, doing hip operations, why should a person not get a hip operation or even heart surgery because there's a pandemic? People do die on waiting lists. There's no reason not to allow this, and dare Ottawa to crack down, especially in the current climate. Or rather, there's no reason not to do it except lack of nerve. And if the UCP hasn't got the nerve, we sure do. So, on the subject where we go from here, the answer is you go out to dinner when I finally shut up, and then you go home and I go for a swim and life resumes. But in our lives, engagement in public policy is a major thing. And tomorrow we may rest because it's Sunday, but Monday we'll be back at it. engaged in the political process, engaged in the intellectual one, giving money to the JCCF, giving money to CD Howe, giving money to EADM and whoever that guy is who won't shut up. But I say it again, stop giving money to politicians who are only there for you on fundraising day. And in making this pitch for a better deal for Firewall Plus and a better deal for Alberta, remember, courage is not rashness. As you may remember from last year, if you were there, I said one of my rules of politics, PR, and life generally is if they think you're a clown, don't show up in a fright wig. Don't let your opponents provoke you into behaving like their stereotype of you. Don't let their slippery immobility cause you to start sputtering. The frustration is justified, but it's counterproductive. When we go home from here, we stand on principle, we insist on action. Tell your MLA, I am going to watch what you do on this, and I will become your worst nightmare if you don't put your shoulder to the wheel in caucus and in public. I will attend local meetings. I will vote in the next primary election. I will send letters to the editor. I will post things online, and you won't wear me out. We will see who rusts first. You know, Alberta autonomy, complete or within a federation, is a complicated thing. Governments are big, and like oil tankers, they don't turn very nimbly. And there's a lot to think about. I've mentioned a few of what I think are the major items, but there are others, both big and small, where you want to have more local control. But we must demand the big ones, and once we've demanded them, they must be given, starting with a dramatic reduction in equalization. So where do we go from here? Well, the first place we don't go is nowhere. The second place is in circles. We're not going to go home and come back next year with nothing having changed. Or if that's what happens, please do come back next year, bring your friends. We'll hope COVID-19 is gone and some other dang thing hasn't replaced it. But we will not come back here next year with nothing having happened because we didn't do all that we could do. That phrase that I quoted last year, suaviter in modo, fortiter in re, that is to be pleasant in manner but firm on substance. We're going to be neither timid nor rash, neither simple-minded nor so sophisticated we get paralysis through analysis. We're going to be neither hasty nor inert. Remember that thing about Mackenzie King. We are not going to go forward shapeless, blunt, unable to find and choose a side. We will not pile a parliamentary committee on a royal commission. We will not postpone and abstain and end up always where we were before. We have a vision, and it's not to do by quarters only the things we can't avoid entirely. And no more politicians who do that stuff and wear us out by the preposterousness with which they refuse ever to stand on principle or act decisively. We're going to be Aristotelian. We're going to be prime movers because there is greatness in Alberta, and we are going to go forth from this meeting and help unleash it. That is where we go from here. And thank you all very much for coming and taking part in this gathering.